thinking again about some of these psychological mechanisms that are involved in the emergence of hallucinations in people with schizophrenia. Another mechanism that's been argued might be contributing to the formation of auditory hallucinations is the idea of source monitoring. That is, people with schizophrenia may have disruptions in their ability to monitor the source of their psychological experiences. By this model, people with schizophrenia might actually think a thought, right? They might experience a thought, but they might attribute that thought to someone else. They may not be able to tag it appropriately as coming from the self. Consistent with this idea, there have been studies that in fact have found that if you give people with schizophrenia a series of questions in which they offer answers, and then you come back a week, 2 weeks later, and show them responses to questions, some of which they generated, some of which the experimenter generated. In fact, people with schizophrenia are much more likely to make attributions about things that they said, but instead attribute them to the experimenter having said them or the experimenter having given that response. So there does seem to be some evidence that people with schizophrenia may have some deficit in their ability to monitor the source of information. In addition, with respect to hallucinations, there's been the idea that people may just be having these experiences and just simply can't tag them appropriately. There's a disruption in the tagging of psychological experiences. An idea that's been related to this that a researcher by the name of Christopher Frith has thought about and has described is the idea that there is corollary discharge. That is to say, when we have a thought, there is a discharge that goes along with the thought that lets us know that we generated it, right? So we have a thought, but there's also some quality of that experience of having the thought that suggests to us that we generated it rather than someone else telling us the thought. And what has been argued is that this ability to sort of tag one's own thoughts may be disrupted and may be leading to the experience of hallucinations in people with schizophrenia. Experimentally, people have tried to assess this hypothesis by doing what's called, or giving what's called distorted auditory feedback. In this paradigm, a person with schizophrenia who has hallucinations might be asked to say things and then hear themselves say these things back to them, right? Experience it back to them. But it's experienced that auditory feedback that's given back, that's returned, is disrupted in some way. That is, perhaps the pitch has changed, right? Perhaps the duration from when the person says it to the feedback may be off. And we may have all experienced this in times when we've been, for example, talking on the phone. There's a disruption on the phone and we start getting a delay on our voice, it's sort of delayed feedback. And it can be very disruptive to conversation if you've ever experienced that, right? There's a sort of short delay. And then it becomes very hard to continue to speak when you're hearing your own voice sort of coming back at you. The idea here has been that if people with schizophrenia really have a difficulty tagging their own self-generated voices, that they may be less disrupted by this delayed auditory feedback, right? Because if you're not tagging your uttered expressions appropriately, then if those uttered expressions return back to you at a different pitch, for example, they'd probably be less likely to disrupt your ongoing speech because you're not tagging the output to begin with as your own speech. In these types of paradigms, surprisingly, people with schizophrenia are actually more disrupted by the delayed auditory feedback that's been changed in pitch, suggesting that, in fact, that perhaps it isn't necessarily a mistagging of thoughts that are leading to the emergence of auditory hallucinations.